Such a shame it didn't turn up just 1 year earlier. Pause on that. Let it sit. Because that single sentence, spoken in regimental messes and veterans' reunions for decades after the guns fell silent, captures something essential about the A34 Comet. Not failure. Never failure. Something worse. A tragedy of timing. The grief not for what a machine couldn't do, but for what it never had the chance to prove. What if the Comet had rolled off the production line in late 1943 instead of early 1945? The counter-factual isn't difficult to construct. The technology existed. The engineering was sound. The only thing missing was time. And time, in war, is measured in lives. By the summer of 1942, British armour was bleeding across the Western Desert. The men inside those steel coffins knew something was desperately wrong. The cruiser tanks that were supposed to revolutionise mobile warfare had become pyres instead. Undergunned, underarmoured, outclassed by German designs that seemed to improve with every engagement. The Crusader, which had carried such promise, was plagued by mechanical failures that made every advance a gamble. The Cromwell was coming, yes, but even as the first production models rolled off the lines, the men who understood armoured warfare could see that it too would arrive with the same fatal flaw that had haunted British tank design since the beginning. The inability to kill a German tank before it killed you. Here's what makes this so maddening. The problem wasn't talent, wasn't engineering capability. British industry had produced the magnificent Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a detuned derivative of the legendary Merlin that powered the Spitfire. And this powerplant gave the Cromwell a turn of speed that would have been the envy of any tank commander in the world. The Cromwell could do 40 miles per hour. 40 in a tank. That's genuinely remarkable. But speed without the means to kill your enemy is just a faster way to reach your own death. The 75mm gun fitted to the Cromwell was adequate for infantry support. Against the frontal armour of a Panther or the massive plates of a Tiger, little better than throwing stones. British tankers knew this. German tankers knew this. And somewhere in the corridors of the War Office and the Ministry of Supply, the bureaucrats were beginning to understand that unless something changed, the blood price would continue to mount. The British had developed the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, magnificent weapon, capable of punching through any German armour at combat ranges. But fitting it to a tank proved maddeningly difficult. The recoil was savage, the breach was enormous, the ammunition was awkward to handle in the confined space of a turret designed for something smaller. The Sherman Firefly, that desperate improvisation marrying the 17-pounder to the American M4 chassis, proved the concept was viable. It also demonstrated its limitations: cramped turret, reduced ammunition stowage, crews in a constant struggle against the weapon they were trying to serve. What the British Army needed was a tank designed from the ground up around a powerful gun. Armour that could resist the weapons it would face. The mobility to exploit a breakthrough. They needed the Comet. And they needed it in 1943, not 1945. The fact that they got it 2 years too late would haunt the memories of every man who crewed a Churchill or Sherman through Normandy. Every widow who received a telegram about a husband burned alive in a tank that couldn't compete. Every commander who watched his regiment reduced to smoking wrecks because his vehicles simply could not answer what the enemy brought to the field. The A34 Comet began its life as what military procurement calls an interim solution. That designation sounds innocuous. In practice, it often means the best we can do while we wait for something better. The British General Staff wanted the A41, which would eventually become the legendary Centurion. But the A41 was a clean sheet design that would take years to develop. The men fighting in Italy and preparing for the invasion of France couldn't wait years. So the Comet was born as an evolution, not a revolution. An improved Cromwell that incorporated the lessons learned in blood across North Africa and Sicily. The heart of this machine was its gun, the 77mm HV. Understanding this weapon requires understanding the problem it solved. The 17-pounder was too large for comfortable tank mounting, but its ballistic performance was desperately needed. The solution was elegant. Take the 17-pounder's barrel and shorten it. Accept a modest reduction in muzzle velocity, but gain a weapon that could be mounted in a properly designed turret with adequate room for the crew to work. The resulting 77mm HV gun could penetrate 110mm of armour at 1,000 yards. Not quite as much stopping power as the full-length 17-pounder's 118mm, but still capable of killing any German tank at normal combat ranges. And, this is crucial, it could be served by a crew that had room to breathe, room to work, room to fight their vehicle as a weapon system rather than as a cramped torture chamber. The designation 77mm was itself a deliberate choice. The weapon fired the same projectile as the 17-pounder, but from a shorter cartridge case. The ammunition wasn't interchangeable. To prevent catastrophic confusion, crews accidentally loading the wrong rounds with potentially fatal results, the War Office designated the shortened weapon with a different caliber number, even though the actual bore diameter was identical to the 17-pounder's 76.2mm. This administrative decision would cause its own headaches in the field, supply officers struggling to understand why Comets needed different ammunition from Sherman Fireflies, despite both vehicles nominally mounting weapons of similar capability. The hull evolved from the Cromwell, but evolved substantially. Armour thickness increased to 32 to 74 mm on the hull and 57 to 102 mm on the turret, a significant improvement in protection over its predecessor. The suspension was strengthened with additional return rollers. The turret received electrical traverse, a feature that dramatically improved the crew's ability to engage targets quickly. No more hand cranking the turret while a Panther's gun tracked toward you. The trade-off for this additional weight was a reduction in top speed, from the Cromwell's startling 40+ miles per hour to a more modest 32. But this was a sacrifice that combat experience had proven worthwhile. Speed without survivability was merely a faster way to die. Production was assigned to Leyland Motors. The first mild steel prototype was ready in February 1944. February 1944. 4 months before the invasion of Normandy. 4 months. If the development timeline had been compressed by even a year, if the decision to build the Comet had been made in early 1942 rather than 1943, there might have been Comets wading ashore at Gold Beach. Comets pushing through the bocage. Comets answering the Panthers in the hedgerows. Instead, the prototype went through its trials while other men's sons died in inferior vehicles. Production began in September 1944. The liberation of Paris was already a memory. To understand what the Comet missed, you need to understand what the summer of 1944 looked like from inside a British tank. The D-Day landings had succeeded, but success had brought its own special kind of hell. The Norman bocage, that nightmare landscape of ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, where every field was a potential killing ground, and every hedge concealed a German gun. The Cromwells and Shermans that pushed inland found themselves in a war for which they were desperately ill-suited. Close-range ambushes, where the first shot almost always won. And German armour consistently fired first. Then came Operation Goodwood, launched on the 18th of July 1944. 3 armoured divisions attacked across ground that should have favoured the tanks. Open terrain southeast of Caen, where mobility, British armour's great theoretical advantage, could finally be exploited. The morning began with the thunder of 1,000 bombers carpeting the German positions. The ground shook so violently that tank crews felt their teeth rattle inside their vehicles. Dust rose in great brown clouds that obscured the sun. For a moment, just a moment, there was hope. It didn't last. As the armoured columns advanced, they encountered a defence in depth that included the 21st Panzer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, supported by dug-in 88mm guns of the Luftwaffe flak batteries. The first sign of trouble was a Sherman simply exploding, turrets spinning lazily into the air on a column of orange flame. Then another. Then a Cromwell, its driver desperately trying to reverse, even as the second round punched through the engine deck and turned the vehicle into an inferno. The 80s spoke with a flat, echoing crack that veteran tankers learned to fear more than any other sound in the war. By the time the echo reached your ears, the round had already arrived. In 3 days of fighting, the British lost over 400 tanks, more than the entire strength of an armoured division, advanced barely 7 miles. The Cromwells and Shermans burned because they couldn't answer what they faced, because their guns couldn't reach the enemy before the enemy reached them. Inside the stricken vehicles, crews scrambled for hatches that sometimes opened and sometimes didn't. Fought to escape through drivers' ports while flames licked at their coveralls. Made choices in seconds that determined whether they lived or died. The Comet would have changed the calculus of these engagements. Its 77mm HV gun, firing APCBC ammunition, could have penetrated the frontal armour of a Panther at ranges where the Panther's own 75mm gun could penetrate the Comet. Rough parity. The kind of situation that transforms lopsided slaughters into genuine armoured duels. With a PDS ammunition, which achieved muzzle velocities of 3,400 feet per second and increased penetration by roughly 50%, the Comet could have engaged Panthers and even Tigers at ranges where German crews would have felt genuinely threatened. This was the capability the British had needed since the first Tiger appeared in Tunisia in late 1942. The answer to a problem that had cost thousands of lives. The sound alone would have been different. Not the inadequate bark of a 75mm knowing it couldn't penetrate, but the authoritative crack of a weapon designed to kill what it aimed at. But September 1944 came and went. The Comets remained in Britain, working up, training, preparing for a war already entering its final act. The Ardennes offensive that December, the Battle of the Bulge, the war's largest engagement on the Western Front, found the British and Americans fighting with the same vehicles they'd landed in Normandy. The Germans brought Panthers and Tigers, and the massive King Tigers of the heavy tank battalions. The Allies answered with Shermans, whose crews had learned to fear open ground. With Fireflies, whose gunners knew they were the primary targets of every German tank within visual range. The Comet was still crossing the Channel, still being issued to units, still being prepared for battles already decided. The first Comets entered combat in March 1945. The 11th Armoured Division crossing the Rhine as the final campaigns began. By this point, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans were falling back on all fronts. Fuel exhausted, industrial base destroyed, veteran crews dead or captured. The great armoured battles that might have tested the Comet against Panther or Tiger would never materialise. There simply weren't enough German tanks left operational to offer such tests. The Comet had arrived for the denouement, not the drama. The crews sat in their new vehicles, engines idling, waiting their turn to cross pontoon bridges that swayed under 33 tons of British steel. The Meteor engines growled with restrained power. These men had trained for months in England, heard the stories from Normandy, the Ardennes, prepared themselves for combat that had consumed entire regiments. Now they were crossing into a Germany already broken. The 77mm gun performed exactly as promised in the limited engagements that followed. Targets that would have required multiple hits from a Sherman, or that would have been simply impossible for a Cromwell, fell to single rounds. The gunners noted how smoothly the electrical turret traverse tracked moving targets, how the loader had room to work, how the commander could actually see the battlefield from his cupola. Everything about the vehicle whispered of what could have been. Though there was one flaw the crews noted. The reverse gear, inherited from the Cromwell transmission, produced what crews described as abysmal reverse speed. Mattered enormously for shoot and scoot tactics. A tank that couldn't reverse quickly was a tank that couldn't break contact, couldn't use hull-down positions effectively, couldn't survive engagements where the first side to disengage was the side that lived. In the staying alive department, that transmission was a genuine liability. The kind of flaw that would have cost lives if the war had lasted longer, if the engagements had been fiercer, if there'd been more Panthers waiting behind the next hedgerow. But holding your own in March 1945 wasn't the same as holding your own in July 1944. The Comet's capabilities, transformative 8 months earlier, were now merely adequate. Better than the Cromwell, better than the Sherman, but arriving into a war where superiority no longer mattered because the enemy was already defeated. The tragedy wasn't that the Comet failed. It succeeded brilliantly at everything asked of it. The tragedy was that it succeeded in a war that no longer needed its success. Here's where the story takes its bittersweet turn. The Comet never got its war, but its mechanical DNA would define something far greater. Remember the A41, that clean sheet design the British really wanted while the Comet served as interim solution? It became the Centurion, and the Centurion would dominate armoured warfare for the next half-century. The features that made the Comet effective, the properly designed turret, the balance between firepower and mobility, the lessons about what crews actually needed to fight their vehicles, all of this informed the Centurion's design. The A41 was a clean sheet design, a separate program from the Comet. But clean sheet didn't mean starting from nothing. The Centurion built directly upon the Comet's foundation, the lessons learned, the problems solved, the understanding of what crews actually needed. The Comet proved what the Centurion would perfect. The Centurion would prove itself in actual combat across the decades that followed. Korea, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. More than 20 armies worldwide would operate Centurions. Some kept them in service for decades. The tank that the Comet helped birth would demonstrate that the design philosophy validated by the Comet, the balance, the crew ergonomics, the firepower, was correct all along. The Comet died young, but its child conquered the world. That's the redemption, bittersweet as it is. The men who crewed Comets through those final weeks of the European war, who felt the potential in those machines and knew what they could have done if only they'd arrived sooner, their vindication came not in their own victories, but in what followed. The Centurion carried forward everything the Comet represented. The acknowledgement that British tank design could be world-class when the priorities were right and the timeline permitted. 1 year earlier. That's all it would have taken. 12 months. A decision made sooner. A prototype completed faster. Production prioritized differently. And the calculus of Goodwood changes. The hedgerows of Normandy become less lethal. The burning Shermans and Cromwells, some of them, not all, but some, stay intact. Some of those telegrams never get sent. We can't know how many. Can't calculate lives saved in a war that happened differently than it did. But the possibility haunts everyone who understands what the comet was, what it could have been. Such a shame it didn't turn up just 1 year earlier. The comet wasn't a failure. It was a success that arrived too late to matter for the war it was designed to fight, but early enough to define the tank that would dominate the Cold War. If you care about the comet, if you felt it was always overlooked, always underappreciated, you're not wrong. You're caring about the future it helped create. The line runs clear from the A34 through the A41 and into every armoured doctrine that followed. The comet matters, just not for the war it missed. Subscribe for more stories like this.